Hello my fair friends, I'm Ruby Ruse, this is Baby Bunny, and welcome to Fairy Fortunes. I wanted to do something a little bit fun today because you know what? We need a little bit of entertainment right now in this crazy time that we're living in. So I wanted to share with you something very fun and something that you could enjoy with your whole family, no matter what their age is, and give to you my top 10 list of fantasy movies that feature a member of the Fae. So I'm very excited to bring this to you, and I hope that you will enjoy my top 10 list and maybe check out some of these great films for yourself. So with that, let's get right into it. The criteria for this list was that it had to be a live action film and a fairy creature had to take a prominent position in the film. So, you know, the hardest film to choose was actually my number 10 position. There were a couple of contenders for this position, but for my number 10 slot, the movie that I chose was the Nanny McPhee movie from 2005. So I just love this film. And what's interesting about this is that the lead actress, Emma Thompson, who I'm a big fan of, she actually wrote the script for this film. And it is based on the Nurse Matilda books by Christiana Brand. Unfortunately, I have never read those books. But the reason that Nanny McPhee takes this number 10 position is because I didn't like the entire franchise. I thought the first movie was just much more charming than the second movie. Oh, it's not bad. So, but I would highly encourage you to check out the Nanny McPhee movies. Number 9 on my list is The Neverending Story from 1984. This is a beautiful film, actually, and even though it was made in the 80s, the special effects in this movie have held up exceptionally well. I think even the most technology-influenced child would still appreciate the story of this film. The reason that it takes the number 9 position is that, unfortunately, the author of the book, The Neverending Story, Michael Ende, absolutely hated this movie. He despised this film, and actually he tried to sue the company making the film in order to keep it off the market. Because of Ende and his litigation against this film, there is probably never going to be a remake of this movie because he wrapped up a lot of legal articles that would make getting the rights to this story very, very difficult now. And you know what? Good. Because this film is really, really lovely. It is worth a watch. I think your whole family would enjoy it. Another reason that it takes the number 9 position is that in this story there are a whole host of fae creatures, but it is set in the context that the fairy realm is all based on human imagination, and that is actually not true. The fae are not necessarily tied to humans, although they can be. They are not our servants. We are not the reason for their being. So that is why it takes the number 9 position. Number 8 is the Spiderwick Chronicles of 2008. Now, the reason that this came down low on the list, Spiderwick Chronicles, the books are just so much better. Anytime you have a movie based on a book, I'm here to tell you that the book is always going to be better, because you just can't take an over 50,000 word novel and turn it into a 2-hour cinematic story. It's just very difficult to do. However, the reason that the Spiderwick Chronicles are lower on my list is because it does quite deviate from the source material in a few critical spots. And also, it's the Spiderwick Chronicles because this is a series of books, and the movie takes all of those stories, those multiple stories, and combines them into one less than 2-hour movie. So for that reason, it took a little bit of a lower spot on my list, but the tale they came up with actually is very good in and of itself. I'm sorry, goblins are not destroyed by tomato sauce, but the tomato sauce scene in this movie is totally worth a watch. This one is pretty scary though, so if you have little ones, they'll probably need a lap to sit on during this movie. Number 7, I chose the 1988 Willow. In the 1980s, we didn't have Rotten Tomatoes or Fandango. In the 1980s, there were critics that wrote about movies in a newspaper or sometimes on the radio. They absolutely despised this movie. So, and critics in the 1980s often would pretty much make or break careers. So the problem that they had with this movie is that Willow was actually written by George Lucas, who is famous for Star Wars, and because of that, the critics complained that this story had too many similarities to the Star Wars story arc. I see some correlations to it, but I think it's a completely different tale than Star Wars. And the fairy world that they have created in this movie is just delightful. And when I first saw this movie in 1988, I'm going to tell you that the trolls really scared me. Okay, they're terrifying. The special effects, once again, much like the Neverending Story, held up incredibly well. And even though it is an older movie, it is still a wonderful story. So what's interesting about this production of Willow is this movie was actually a pioneer of special effects. It reminds you that this was many, many years before CGI became a thing. This movie might have helped the growth of that CGI technology because they created in the movie Willow a technique called morphing, and you can experience this wonderful special effect in Rozelle's transformation from, she goes through a transformation from all these different animals into a human being, and it is an incredible piece of special effects and is totally a wonderful scene worth the watch. Another interesting thing about the story Willow is that the love story between the two supporting characters, Sorsha and Mad Mardigan, was actually real. Joan Whaley and Val Kilmer actually met on the set of Willow and were married later in 1988 when this film was released. So that was a very interesting thing to learn because I always did think that Mad Mardigan and Sorsha's love story was quite compelling, and there's a reason why. Number 6 on my list is going to be somewhat controversial. It's going to be controversial, but it is the 1981 Clash of the Titans. Now, why is the movie The Clash of the Titans that features Greek heroes and gods part of my top 10 fantasy movies with characters of the Fae? The ancient Greeks did not refer to these beings as being fairy creatures, but they definitely fit my definition of the Fae. And we definitely recognize creatures like this as members of the Fae now. Because beings like Pegasus, the winged horse, beings like the witches with the one eye, beings like the Kraken, these were beings that were not gods, but had incredible supernatural powers and were certainly not human and never were human. So in my opinion, these beings fit the criteria of a supernatural fairy being. So, and mind you, I want to make it very clear that I am referring to the 1981 version of The Clash of the Titans. Because you know what? When I was doing some research on this list that I intended to bring you today, I did actually take it upon myself to watch the newer version of The Clash of the Titans, and I could not finish watching that film. I'm just going to pretend that it doesn't exist. I am so glad that Michael Ende made sure that the Neverending Story would never be retold again, because you know what? Leave it be. Leave it be. Yes, the special effects in The Clash of the Titans from 1981 is definitely going to show some age to it. This was long before CGI, and the creatures, especially the Kraken, were done with stop-action animation. Here's the thing about that, though. I have found that newer movies have become so enamored with technology and special effects and finding ways to insert CGI technology that they have stopped caring about the story. And definitely in the 1980s especially, cinematic movies were a medium to tell stories in a way that couldn't be told any other way. That is what the 1981 version of Clash of the Titans does. It tells a great story. So if you can put aside this archaic form of special effects, the story that is outlined in this movie is incredible. And also just the way that it's scripted, where they can convey an emotion, they can convey important information in one line of dialogue. It is outstanding. So I highly recommend the 1981 version of Clash of the Titans, and we're just going to pretend that they never tried to remake this film, because they really shouldn't have. Number 5 is the Harry Potter franchise. Now, I took the whole franchise as one position on this list because I really feel like they all correlate together. I think that you could easily watch one of the Harry Potter movies out of context and still enjoy it. You wouldn't be confused, which is another reason that they take one of the top 5 positions on my list. Now, the fairy creatures are not the main characters, but there's a lot of supporting characters that are fairy creatures. Hagrid being one of the primary ones. Hagrid is half giant. And R.K. Rowling did such a great job of her research on these fairy creatures, and it's just such a great piece of art. The books are better. That's why it's number 5 on the list, because the books are better. But as far as the movies go, they are a delightful piece of work. And of course, the Harry Potter franchise came out with their first movie in 2001. Now, I would have to say that The Prisoner of Azkaban is probably my favorite of the franchise. The reason being is that I really feel that we get to see a lot of growth from different characters in this movie. Particularly the character of Hermione. She really comes into her own in this particular movie, and I really liked the development of that character and how strong and determined and vehement she became. So she definitely is a great role model, I think, for the women of today. And so that is why Prisoner of Azkaban is one of my favorite movies of this particular franchise. The reason that this did not take a higher position on my list, though, is that the last of the saga, the 8th movie in the franchise, the Deathly Hallows Part 2, I really felt like they changed the message of the ending. In the books, the message was much more final, and I feel like they changed that in the films. I don't know why. I guess they wanted to make it more frivolous, maybe? I'm not really sure, but I just didn't really like how they altered that final ending in the series, so that is why it takes the number 5 position. Number 4 is another movie from the 1980s. This was released in 1985 that also kind of got panned by critics. Fairy movies, fantasy movies especially, just were not doing very well in the 1980s. I don't know why, but they just weren't, which is odd because these films that were made, as you'll notice that many of my movies on this list are from the 1980s. These are incredible pieces of cinematography. And also the storytelling is just incredible. These, so the number 4 position on this list is Legend from 1985. And yes, it does star a very young Tom Cruise. What's interesting about the Legend movie is that this is not a movie that was based on a book. This was a script that was entirely made for a cinema audience. So it is a standalone cinematic medium piece, and I just appreciate it for that. I mean, it's wonderful to have our favorite stories that were written adapted for the screen. It is a pleasure to sometimes to see that done. But when somebody comes up with something completely unique for the medium of film, I really appreciate the artistry of that. Legend also stars the actor Tim Curry, who is just an incredible villain. I just appreciate the originality of this movie, and it's a shame that it was so panned by the critics, because I don't think that they were appreciating the artistry that went into this movie and the story that unveiled before you. It just was such a beautiful piece. My favorite scene that really just stayed with me, that I remember it so clearly even now, is the scene where Lady Lily has been captured by the Dark Fae and has been taken to the underworld in their realm. And the king of the Dark Fairies is trying to seduce her because he has fallen in love with her, which is a very classic fairy tale. And so he is trying to seduce Lily, and he gives her all of these incredible gifts. He tempts her with a beautiful necklace, and then there is this amazing scene where a gown is dancing on its own and invites Lady Lily to dance with it, and that dance is finally what makes her turn and embrace the Dark Fae. And it's just such a beautiful tale. Now that I'm older, I can appreciate that this scene is very much akin to the Persephone story. So the costuming of this makeup, the prosthetics that they use for makeup is just incredible. Once again, this movie was not made with the CGI technology. It was not available in the 1985 when this movie was made. So all of the creature work was done with makeup, and it was done with puppeteering in some places, and it just is incredible, the work that was done with this movie. And Tim Curry is just a glory to watch. I highly, highly recommend this movie. Number 3 on my list actually surprised me. And this is the 2007 Stardust. This surprised me was because this tale was written in a novel first by one of my very favorite authors, Neil Gaiman. And I am very, very sheepishly admitting that I have never read this particular book, and now that I know that this was based on one of his novels, I have to read this story because I'm sure that the novel is better. It has to be because it was written by Neil Gaiman. However, what I have found is that Neil Gaiman's stories, the scripts that they produce from Neil Gaiman's works, generally translate well, I feel, to film. And so that might be why the Stardust film is so, so good. Now there are some fairy elements to this. The one main character is a fallen star, and so I would lump her in with the Fae. You could argue that she's more of a celestial being, but she's not an angel, she's not something divine, she is a fallen star, and so therefore in my opinion, that she is a member of the Fae. And definitely the land that they are traversing in through the story is definitely a land of fairy. So it is just such a heartening film, especially during these really chaotic times. Definitely curling up in a cozy blanket with your family and watching this film is just going to bring you nothing but joy. So and Michelle Pfeiffer is also in this movie as the main antagonist and witch of the film, and she is absolutely brilliant. I just love her so much. Number 2 on the list, I'm sure you're not going to be shocked, is the 2001 Lord of the Rings trilogy. I am very impressed that with the advent of CGI, like I said, I've been a little bit disappointed with modern age movies because they rely, I think, too heavily on CGI, and they become too concerned with how incredible they can make their special effects that I feel like they don't focus enough on the story that they're trying to tell. That is not the case with the Lord of the Rings trilogy. They did an incredible job. And the group of actors, especially Boromir and Aragorn, the 2 human heroes that we have featured in these movies, I feel like they knew what they were doing. They really had captured the essence, I feel, of those characters. And also, you know, and Gandalf too. Ian McKellen was incredible as the great wizard Gandalf the Grey. And I really felt like, I would be surprised to learn that they hadn't read the stories, because it just seemed to me that they knew those characters on a very, very deep level, and I just appreciated the work that they did bringing those beings to life. And also Frodo and Sam Gamgee, they just did an incredible job portraying these beings. They had the right look, in my opinion. They just walked, I felt, right out of the pages of J.R.R. Tolkien's work. So I was okay with some of the adaptations that they had to make to create these films. I wasn't mad at them, per se. The book is always better. The book is better. It is. Done. But these movies, you can appreciate them and not have to read the books, I think, to really love and enjoy them. I just think they did a spectacular job on making these characters come to life, and they did a wonderful job. I did not take the #1 position, largely because I include, like I said, I'm looking at entire franchises here. What you don't know is as I mentioned, I struggled with the number 10 position when franchise actually got removed from the list because the second movie was just so bad, in my opinion. I do include the Hobbit movies along with this trilogy, and I thought they did a fairly good job. I really loved the actor that played Bilbo Baggins. I thought he did a wonderful job. Really liked the dwarf characters. I thought they did a wonderful job. The makeup that they did with some of the dwarves, the hairstyles, they were really well done. But they were trying a little too hard in the Hobbit movies. They were like, oh, the Lord of the Rings did so well, let's make the Hobbit too. And instead of making one movie, they made 3 because they really were being greedy, in my opinion. And I really feel that that's kind of what happened with some movies that were remade or either given a sequel, is that it was like, oh, this worked, let's make more money. And truly, when you're trying to make art, being concerned about how much money you're going to make is really not the way to go. I do have a favorite. I think that The Dark Tower is probably my favorite. It's also my favorite book. And the reason I think that is that much like Prisoner of Azkaban and Hermione's transformation and journey and growth, the Dark Tower has that with many of the characters. A lot of the characters have surging moments of growth where they come to critical decisions in their lives, and it's just, I just love the journey that they go through, and especially with Boromir, his is just so tragic, but it's just also just so beautiful and heroic. The journey of those characters is really the best in the Dark Tower. That is true of the book as well. So read the books as well, but these are fantastic films. And The Hobbit, they're not bad films, they just went a little too far. I think it could have been made into one movie. And number one! Finally, we are at number one slot on my list. And I know you're shocked, it's another movie. This movie was made in 1986. And it is the movie Labyrinth, with the great David Bowie being the Goblin King. And David Bowie, I think, is in large part why this is number one on my list. Because I have talked many times on this channel about the Fae. And I have reiterated over and over again that the Fae do not have any word for evil in their language. The Fae recognize things that are destructive, and they recognize things that bring people to their best selves. But they do not recognize evil. So David Bowie's Goblin King is a perfect example of a fairy creature, in my opinion, because he comes across as this very dark, very scary, very dangerous Fae, and he is. But everything that he does in the course of this story is done for the love of the young girl in this movie. And he does not in any way, shape, or form think that anything he has done is evil. And that he is very, very indicative of the Fae. So that is one of the reasons that this movie is my top favorite fantasy movie featuring a member of the Fae. Another thing is that once again, Labyrinth is an original piece that was done expressly for the medium of film. It was not based on a book. This script was written for a cinematic audience. And all of the creatures that they have made were done with puppetry, they were done with makeup, sometimes they were done with makeup and puppetry together. Just some incredible work that they did with this film. Also, the original soundtrack done by David Bowie is incredible. It is still one of my favorite albums to this day. I also love the final message of the story. Basically, the journey that Sarah, the young girl, goes through is that she learns that she holds the power, that she herself is capable of greatness. And that is something that I have said also on this channel too, is that everyone is capable of greatness. You just have to show the courage to display it and find it and be it. And so Labyrinth is just a perfect example, I think, of a fairy message, is that everyone is capable of greatness, and that in the land of the Fae there is no good or evil. There is both and neither at the same time. So if I have not listed your favorite fantasy movie on this list, please leave it down below in the comments and tell me why it is your favorite movie. And if you disagree with some of the lists that I have given you, if you absolutely hate one of these films that I've mentioned, I do want to hear your thoughts, so please tell me in the comments below. And with that, have a fairyful day.